Well, welcome to another episode of our webinar series, Communities in Partnership, Ensuring Equity in the Time of COVID-19. We are thrilled to welcome you all today to this webinar. We're at the start of the month of September, and today we'll be focusing on educational equity in the time of COVID. We do want to take a moment today and continue to acknowledge the sustained loss of life during COVID-19 pandemic and a global call for social justice against racism. I also want to make sure that each of you all are contributing to this intensive effort to bring attention to the US Census, as well as registration for voting in the upcoming election. This webinar series is hosted by Community Campus Partnerships for Health and the University of North Carolina's Center for Health Equity Research. The series is co-sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars National Leadership Institute. Today marks another step forward in our webinar series that has shared powerful and thoughtful information on COVID-19. Joining me today as a co-moderator of this session is my colleague and friend, Mr. Al Richmond, Executive Director of Community Campus Partnerships for Health. We appreciate so much the positive feedback and suggestions for future suggestions that you all continue to offer us. And we ask you to use social media. We have our social media handles there, our hashtag equity in COVID, as well as our handles on Twitter that are listed there as well. I'm going to pass it now to my colleague Al Richmond to share our learning objectives as well as some of our ground rules.
Thank you, Giselle. So I want to share our objectives today, and they are and have remained constant over now almost 5 months of you inviting us into your homes and into your workplaces. And they include to share diverse perspectives on COVID-19 and its impact on health equity, to develop a network to support systemic changes in response to COVID-19, and then to explore collaborations and partnerships in promoting equity and the response to COVID-19. I do want to take the time to share a few ground rules for our session today and time. And that is that, number one, your audio and phones will remain muted for the duration of the call. Questions to our speakers may be placed in the Q&A box. We will not be able to monitor the chat box for questions, so please place them in the Q&A box. You may utilize chat to message all attendees during the session. This webinar is being recorded, and this and prior webinars are available on the CCPH and CHER website for review and to share with your network. Again, welcome. Giselle.
So as we enter the month of September, we're on the second day of September, and so many of us are thinking about the reentry into schools in the midst of COVID-19. We know educational attainment is a tremendous predictor in this country of wealth and health, and a key driver of well-being in this country. And so I'm excited today for us to examine this issue about the challenges and opportunities for achieving educational equity during COVID-19 using a critical intersectional lens as we think about the many factors that families are facing as students, children, and professional students re-enter schools virtually, in hybrid formats, or in person. Our first presenter today is Danielle Corby-Archie, an educator, visionary, and strategist. She is the Chief Executive Officer for Strategic Learning Solutions and currently is a doctoral fellow at Texas Southern University in curriculum instruction with an emphasis on equity and culturally responsive pedagogy. Danielle has been an educator for over 20 years in the K through 12 space, and with a special emphasis on developmental and intellectual disabilities. And so I'm thrilled to be able to have her join us today. Danielle, did you want to share your slides?
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction. That was very generous. I actually have probably about 30 years of experience in education, even though I have this baby face. But, I'm really excited to be here. We work with students. At this point in time, I teach students who want to become special education teachers, and I think that I'm in a really incredibly unique position to be able to impact new educators that are going out into the field. And so this is some of the things that I tell them about working with students with special needs with an equity mindset. So I just want to talk a little bit about the overrepresentation of students, of African-American students in special ed, and the history of special education. One of the historical factors that impacted special education was the eugenics movement in the 1920s and 30s. And this actually became the purview to academics, where only the healthy seed must be sown. So this kind of set a precedent of how we looked at individuals with disabilities in education. There were several cases that impacted education as we know it. Buck versus Bell. This is where the Supreme Court Justice Wendell Holmes found that it was necessary to prevent those who were manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. So this laid the legal groundworks to start sterilizing individuals based on intellectual ability. As we know, Rosemary Kennedy, John Kennedy's sister, she had a botched lobotomy in 1941 because she did have emotional disturbance. So there was not really a way of dealing with individuals with special needs other than exclusion and really trying to just oppress them and making sure that they're not being able to reproduce. So then along came civil rights era, and Brown versus the Board of Education set that off. And this is where schools began to now incorporate desegregation and really look at the rights of the individual students. Moving on to 1972, Mills versus the Board of Education, where specifically special education law said that you have to deal with students who have special needs without suspending them. And then IDEA came along, which is federal law in 1990, where it really outlined how to deal with students with special needs and how to discipline those students. And it really took a lot of care in terms of disciplining those students with special needs. IDEA also recognized in 2004, when it was reauthorized, that there was an overrepresentation of African-American students. And in fact, during Obama's presidency, Arne Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education, found that not only was there an overrepresentation of African-Americans in special ed, indeed, African-American students on a whole achieved far less than their non-disabled, and then non-African-American students. So when we look at the achievement gap, this is a period of over 15 years, and it continues today. In reading, there's an achievement gap between the white and Black students. In math, there's an achievement gap. But far more concerning is that this gap is persistent even today. So what does discipline look like across the United States? There is a disproportional discipline in the United States. There have been many studies that have concluded that African-American students are disciplined far more harshly and more severely than students who are not African-Americans. So, and this is just going across the United States, and it's persistent, and there's a preponderance of evidence that African-American students are being suspended even as young as 5 years old in kindergarten and pre-K. So what does that mean? That means that there's an intersection of special education and African-American, which makes this population the most vulnerable population in the school system. African-American students who have special needs. This is a photo that was taken. The first photo is a photo of of a young man that was taken in the late 1970s. And this photo, I'm sure many of you all have seen the video of the young lady being violently removed from the classroom because she refused to give up her cell phone. So these injustices continue to happen to African American students, and we continue to see that it has a negative impact not only on their academic success, but also on their psychological success as well. So let's talk about debunking the myth. In 1956, and first I want to go back a little bit. There have been studies done that medical students in as contemporary as 2011 have believed that African Americans don't feel the same amount of pain as Europeans, right? That when we go to the doctor, we're not considered, our pain is not considered to be as severe as other individuals who go to the doctor. So let's think about, are African Americans different? Well, in 1956, Michelle Gerber did a study in Uganda and she wanted to see if malnutrition had an effect on the developmental rate of babies. And what she found in that study was that, in fact, these babies often accelerated in their development, regardless of the nutrition that was provided. So they were walking a lot earlier, they were crawling a lot earlier, lifting their head a lot earlier. The environment that the Ugandan babies were in was a very rich and supportive environment. Well, in 1965, a professor in Philly, having seen this study, went on to replicate this study to determine what type of preventative medications should babies take to make sure that they're developing at the same rate as European babies. And so they found that these babies were actually developing at or above the rate of their white counterparts. So in 2006, the study was replicated again as they were making the infant scale, the Bayley infant scale of development. And they also found that African American babies met the developed milestones at or above the rate of their European counterparts. So what does that mean? That means that Black babies are developing at or above the rate of their European counterparts. So what is the reason? What's the explanation for this academic and achievement gap, this discipline disparities? In fact, what they found was that African American students typically did not stop developing. That African American students typically stop developing at a normal rate at around the age of 5. And that really corresponds with when they go to school. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is not, it's a movement and it's a mindset that says that people are able to resolve conflicts with each other through a natural process of relationship building. So what are the components of restorative justice? Restorative justice, again, it's not a checklist, it's a mindset. So we have to look at restorative justice through an equity mindset, where we're moving from conscious incompetence to conscious competence. When we look at trauma-informed practices, they are driven by an equity mindset. So what are some of the preventative restorative components? Social emotional learning and culturally responsive pedagogy is critical components in preventative restorative strategies. So what does that mean? That means that we create safe spaces for students so that they're able to learn. How do we do that virtually? We create safe spaces by having one-on-one conversations, by involving parents. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But culturally responsive pedagogy is it's a method of teaching that validates student cultures and where they come from, and it allows students to really connect with those educators. What are some more responsive restorative components? So this is after the student has gotten in trouble. Restorative circles, they're incredibly helpful in having students be able to express themselves and really listen. One of the things that most students say is that teachers don't listen to them when they speak. And that is absolutely true, because there's a mindset of that, you know, that we have children should be seen and not heard. And that continues today. There's a cultural difference sometimes between teachers and students. And so even as a student is explaining, there may be bias that the teacher has to unpack before they can actually listen to that student. So restorative circles allow a student to remove themselves from that particular environment and have a safe space where they can actually discuss what's happening. Positive meditation rooms. Students in Chicago's Upper East Side have been experiencing incredible success with positive meditation rooms. They go to these rooms and they call it reflective rooms, and they practice breathing, they practice meditation. It helps them calm down and recenter, and then they can talk about what happened. And a lot of times, if we listen to children, we can understand where they are. The restorative alternatives to suspension are, you know, behavior contracts, restitution, have the students work it off if they damage something, community service, have them go into the community and actually develop positive relationships with corporations and individuals in the community. They maybe should go to counseling instead of being suspended. Require that the parents attend. And then also, instead of letting them do that art class, maybe they need to do a skills instruction class, social skills, or you know, how to be polite, how to refuse politely. Maybe we need to provide mini courses for these students. And so I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of what what we focus on is restoring the dignity of the individual who's been affected, and also restoring the relationships between the individuals who has done the behavior to somebody. So when we look at COVID in terms of education, it's incredibly important to include restorative practices, because students right now are feeling out of sorts, just being at home, and particularly students with special needs. They have a lot of resources at school that are sometimes lacking at home, and parents, based on the schools, based on what the school provides, should be able to focus on those student needs. And that's it for me. I'm definitely open to questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle. We're going to go forward with Dr. Sherrick Hughes' presentation, and then we'll bring you both back for questions afterwards. Dr. Hughes is a professor of education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an author of 2 books. And we're going to make sure that these are chatted into the chat box so that you have them. Autoethnography, the process, product, and possibility for critical social research. And his second book, or his first book actually, The Evolving Significance of Race, Living, Learning, and Teaching. Dr. Hughes engages in scholarship involving social context of education, critical race studies, implicit and explicit racial bias, and de-biasing and anti-racist strategies, as well as combining that with qualitative and mixed methodology. His scholarship has informed universities, school districts, other nonprofit agencies, has been featured in the media, and as well as arguments in the North Carolina Supreme Court cases. He received a 2016 Distinguished Scholar Award from the American Educational Research Association, and is a 2020 Book Award for his autoethnography. Thank you, Dr. Hughes, so much for being with us today. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you. And thank you all for your attendance. Let's see, I'm going to share a screen with you. Allows. There we go. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that screen share. So
Yes,
so that we have more time for questions, I will just move, I won't touch on each of these slides, but I'll move through the slides briefly and touch upon some of them that I think are most important. And I wanted to thank Danielle too, because she touched upon so many of the things that I think are crucial to where we're going. So in 2012, I developed this matrix, what I call a matrix compass for the matrix of social forces. And then as I got the call about today's webinar, I started to think about how this matrix of social forces influence the severity of COVID-19 and marginalized populations, particularly in the Black community, where I was raised and where I've done much of my research. This compass metaphor was used to suggest, first of all, that there's so many factors that are involved in our daily lives that are beyond race, class, and gender. And we also have to think about not thinking beyond those are key central forces, but also we have to think about the key developmental pathways. And so this little compass key here to develop these developmental pathways came from the work of Dr. James Comer, who's a child psychiatrist at Yale University. And it's essentially what some people call thinking about the whole child. So we think about what's happening socially, cognitively, psychological, emotional, physical, ethical, and then linguistic as far as expressive, how they express language, and also receptive linguistically. And so using this dial, I started to think through, and as I teach my students, I teach both a course that is pre-service educators, but now also, of course, teach a lot of doctoral student courses on research methods and also urban education and education of African Americans, and courses that deal with race and equity and bias and de-biasing. Part of what I think the students appreciated about this compass was helping them to put some language to being able to situate when it's the movement of this dial on the compass, if you can think about it that way. Hopefully someday I'll make it so it's a lot more interactive. I'll have to connect with some of my friends in animation or something. But the idea is that it's okay to pivot the center to focus on gender, to pivot the center to focus on social class, to pivot the center to focus upon race. And so today I'm pivoting the center of the work because they're all involved, and intersectionality is extremely important. That's what a compass shows, but when you move one dial, doesn't mean that class and gender are no longer there or any additional factors. It just means I'm gonna pivot the center to focus the discussions on the racial identity and equity pieces today. And part of that is because some of you may have already read about the importance of racial identity and structural racism and its influence on the severity of COVID-19. again, in particular Black communities. And the CDC website has this information available. And as you can see on the slide here, some of the many inequities and social determinants of health, and particularly thinking about racial and ethnic identity, can actually increase the risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19, as many of you have seen the news, and that's been all over the news.
Eric, can you enlarge your slides to view?
Yes, there we go.
Please.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll give you a little time to for a second. When I can always come back to that piece, but again, you can see at the bottom here, that's available. Specifically thinking about hypertension, obesity, severe obesity, all of these sort of conditions of comorbidities when it comes to COVID-19 are extremely important. So I started, as the CDC started putting out more information about, and more research was starting to be done about the connections between how racial inequities are contributing to, again, the increased risk of, excuse me, of getting sick and dying from COVID-19. I started thinking more about how that connected with the work that we do. And so in education research, and also my colleagues in the healthcare side as well, start thinking about both of us. And then also, as I talked with Dr. Corby Smith about what are some possibilities that how we may work together to hopefully help to decrease some of this risk of particular marginalized groups of getting sick and dying of COVID-19. So in education researchers, one of these areas, a good friend of mine, William Smith, Dr. William Smith, is a professor at the University of Utah, developed this concept of racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue has actually been a piece now published about racial battle fatigue in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders. What he noticed in his research, particularly working on and doing research with Blacks in the US who were working in predominantly and historically white institutions, that many of the things they reported to him and his research and his ethnographies and case studies, and then others, his students and others who have replicated the work, they were reporting having symptoms that were similar to soldiers who had been in the front lines of battle. You know, things that were inexplicable given other parts of their health. So, anxieties, shortness of breath, starting to lose their hair, eating disorders, all these other things that he started to realize that part of what all of them had in common that they were discussing is that they constantly talked about experiencing racial inequities, racial microaggressions, other forms of racism at work and in their communities. And certainly you may think about how what we're experiencing in the aftermath of George Floyd with issues related to policing and fatal incidents with the police as it relates to Blacks. All of these things people were talking about, and that's where he came up with this term of racial battle fatigue. Implicit bias, as I said, is part of the work that I've done also in education that many others are also starting to do in education. And then on the health research side, there's, and caregiving side, there's starting to be some research on issues like to deal with hypertension, which is one of those things as a comorbidity, and hypertension, one of the connections to racial battle fatigue was the development of Vidal, which some people know about, some people never heard of, some people may have forgotten about. It's the one drug that was developed specifically for Blacks for hypertension. As soon as I learned about it, I started reading more about pharmacogenomics. This was earlier on in my career, gosh, it was about 2003, 2004 when I first heard about it. And of course, as you might guess, one of the things that was concerning me is that I know that identity, people identifying as Black is one thing, but how genetics work and with all the blood admixture is another. Now, while there is research that people's identities does seem to connect with their ancestry in many ways, it still doesn't tell you what the original pharmacogenomics ideal, the notion was that we'll get to the point where we're able to understand where you are genetically and how your DNA plays out, and then look at what particular drugs may work better or best for you, not just to say, hey, you're Black and here's a drug that works for Blacks, because there's so much admixture, because Black is a socially constructed concept and identity. So my mother, I have on here my mother's experience. My mother was given this drug for hypertension. She kept telling her doctor, it's not helping. It's actually making me feel quite ill. It's not working well. She talked to me. I was like, Mom, yeah, I heard about this drug. You may want to talk to them. And long story short, she said eventually a doctor asked, do you have any other sort of heritage? And, my mom just thought, well, you're the MD, you should know if you're in Northeast North Carolina, most people that identify as Black have an admixture of Black, European, and Native Indigenous ancestry, which my mother does. And so it's just sort of a no-brainer for people that live there. But when you don't understand that categorization of how, and the social construction of race and ethnicity, you see a dark brown woman and assume, well, she's Black, so, and this drug's for Black, so this is how it should work. So that's became obviously that's a healthcare issue, and it gets back to one of the things that Danielle talked about, this racial bias and pain. I'm still on the healthcare research side now, that you can see on the slide here that's been an issue, and we can talk more about that when it's time for questioning. The other piece on the side is on the education research side that's problematic is the reduced recess. So it's so great that Danielle spoke first, because again, she talked about disproportionality and how that works. Disproportionality is become a sort of umbrella term in our research and education to speak to both the disproportionate and inequitable placement of Black, Latino, and impoverished youth into special education categories, particularly the more subjective categories like emotionally disturbed, right? And then once you're placed in that category, that then of course has a major influence on your educational trajectory. Disproportionality also includes those disproportionately not being placed into the gifted education. Again, there's more of a subjective nature to this than what people believe. So like Dr. Sandy Darity at Duke University some years ago did a study showing, there are schools where white students hadn't passed the 95th percentile, which was the benchmark on this Woodcock-Johnson 3 test, yet they were recommended for the gifted program. I mean, scoring in the 61st percentile, for example, and they'd be in the gifted program at the school. Black students scoring higher than that would not be in a gifted program. And then there's this piece of disproportionality, disciplinary actions, which really links to this other sort of comorbidity piece. So one of the things I learned in my research on and research that I'm currently doing with the team from NC State University is that teachers tend to have the same implicit biases as everyone else, while we and other caregivers and care providers also, I assume, have the same sort of level as everyone else in the U.S. And that's not a club we all want to be in, particularly because our jobs to be caregivers, we're those who are what some writers call, we're chronic egalitarians, right? But just because we're chronic egalitarians doesn't mean we also always are cognizant of how we're contributing to these inequities. And it doesn't mean we've always been educated about how to remedy the situation and to both recognize it and address it. So part of what research is finding, and Dr. London just wrote this piece, I believe in the Phi Delta Kappa journal, that once black students are disproportionately receive harsher disciplinary actions just for the committing the same offenses and having the same number of prior offenses, and that's how the disproportionality works. But also schools are still pulling kids out for missing recess. So when we when recess is used as a punishment, and in many of our states, including North Carolina, where childhood obesity, high body mass index, and so on are issues, then taking recess away from a child as a punishment is not a good idea, either way around, and it leads to a host of other things. So another researcher has done work showing that BMI actually decreases when you increase the time of being able to play and have recess. And so that's the type of research that is important, because again, it's another one of those factors that goes along with contributing to the severity of any particular community. How disproportionality that's involved with implicit bias can then link to some of these other health issues that then lead to disproportionality with COVID-19. I'm gonna slide forward really quickly. So then there's explicit bias, which leads to some of the racial battle fatigue issues. So I thought this slide, when my wife learned that I was doing this webinar, she said, people don't want a bunch of words and these things. You need to show some actual graphics that can draw people in. So this was a drawing, and I forget actually where this was published. I can get you the site if you need it. I usually have the illustrator's name in there, but it somehow didn't make it on this one. But as you can see here, this is one of the examples that our students talk about as being part of their overall racial battle fatigue, contributing to it in their anxiety when they're on campuses like ours. Questions about, why are you here? Mind you that at UNC, our average GPA for African American students is of 4.32, I believe, and that's one of the averages that came up. That's just that's the average GPAs are pretty good students, and yet people deny that being the child of an alumnus, being the child of a big donor, being an athlete, which most of the athletes on the campus is on historically and predominantly large campuses are not African American, but they're white because whites participate in so many more of the sports. No one thinks about that for whatever reason. Students coming from different geographical space. And then, of course, having minoritized status, being Black or Latino, Native, Indigenous, and you see him pointing his finger, right? That's the reason I get in. It's this guy. All those others aren't as big a fact, yet they are, and much larger factors. And so I'm gonna move on to getting toward the end here, so we can have so much more time for questions. What are some things that we can do as schools of education and schools of medicine working together for future directions? And what I talked about, this notion of ELC, which is equity literate caregiving. Notion of equity literacy is to be able to recognize and redress and to study and to be able to sustain the types of equity and bias-free environments. And in order to do that, you first have to admit that there is a problem, right? And so implementing the debiasing strategy is important, but first and foremost, autoethnography, which is one of my areas of, especially, it's hard to talk about areas of expertise when you're dealing with social problems like I deal with. You don't ever feel like an expert on anything. But I have had a lot of progress and made a lot of progress with my students before they went out into becoming practitioners and using autoethnography, which is a form of critical self-study that's very systematic and has specific things to follow in order to get yourself from point A to point B with trying to understand where your biases are. That's the best way that I can put it shortly and in a way that's more succinct so we have time. But that's something that I think having a course in particular on autoethnography, doing it as an interprofessional thing, I think could be something that could be really powerful and useful both for schools of education, schools of medicine. Our students could actually be in the same course. And thank you.
Sherrick, thank you so much for your comments. I'm going to move now to questions. And I'm compelled, particularly this moment in time, for when so many folks are thinking about an anti-racist agenda in so many spheres of our lives. I'm compelled by the term racial battle fatigue. I'm going to, given your description of that, I would love Danielle to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the K through 12 space, particularly with students that have at the intersection of special needs, race, and other forms of oppression.
Oh, thank you so much, Giselle. And thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. That was really very informative and quite impacting discussion. I definitely think battle fatigue comes in the form of disengagement, where students are, you know, I call it two types of disengagement: active disengagement and passive disengagement, right? So passive disengagement looks like the head on the desk, eyes closed, not following along with the lesson, and really not participating in the lesson. And active disengagement looks like causing disruptive behaviors, aggressive behaviors in class, behaviors to get the student, they want to get themselves put out of the class because a lot of the times when students are disengaged, there's an effect called the null curriculum. So the null curriculum is the curriculum that doesn't exist, right? The curriculum that is just, they don't have an opportunity to benefit from. So what we consider the null curriculum is African American history. It's a culturally relevant pedagogy. And so that battle fatigue is not something that occurs once or twice in a school lifetime. It's really a battle every single day. And when what we see most often in the classroom is disengagement as one of the effects of that type of battle.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So as we're thinking, we have this backdrop of disproportionality at both the individual level and at the school level, at the geographic level. What can educators do to create in the virtual space a more equitable climate for their classrooms? How can we think about this new reality of the virtual classroom as we're moving into the school year?
Do you mind if I respond?
Please go ahead.
For specifically students with special needs, one of the most important things that educators and parents can do, and most of the times those two are one and the same, is to really break up the lessons in manageable sizes. So you don't want to have your kid on the computer for 4 hours, you know, and in fact, I think an hour is really a long enough period of time. One of the fantastic opportunities that COVID has provided for families who can afford it is to be able to really to make those lessons more meaningful. Specifically, students with special needs require instruction on functional skills. So that could look like making a meal together and looking at those measurements for math skills, being able to gauge when something is completely finished cooking, and that could be culinary skills. Students with special needs also need to feel as though they have an opportunity to reflect on what those lessons were. So either a journal or some, and journals don't have to look like typical journals where they're writing. They can illustrate different pictures. They can do collages or cutouts, projects. They can work in the yard. Earlier this summer, I was fortunate enough to have my family with me, and we did a lot of yard work that now they're all gone, I have to take care of, but so all of these are really meaningful and incredibly helpful activities for students in the time of COVID. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hughes, for letting me throw that in.
Dr. Hughes, please weigh in.
So at the K-12 level, part of it is recognizing that some students have the mechanisms for online internet available, and some don't. And so that's, that's not something that teachers can do alone. That has to be a whole district-wide collaborative work to help the students and those families to actually gain access to internet if they're going to be expecting them to be able to keep up with the homework. So we've seen some more creative ways. Of course, the disproportionality, again, is districts that have, because the traditional public school, where 80% of our students, United States wide, attends, the traditional public schools are still largely funded by property taxes. And so if you live in a area that's a wealthier area, then your kid will have more of an opportunity to have all of these resources. That they'll get a laptop from their school, for example, and as my daughter does. We're in the Chapel Cabarrus City School District, and so she's a 10th grader. She wanted to drop off her old laptop and got a new laptop, and that's a public school. But the school where I grew up, in the county where I grew up, I seriously doubt they had that seamless of an exchange and the poor rural. So we need some. There has to be larger, shifting that dial on the matrix compass to looking at the larger structural and institutional areas. That needs to be a statewide effort to ensure that there's equity there. At the university level, I just read a study showing how there's this inequities as far as professors responding to students by race. So that something like 94% are more likely to respond to a post if it was by a white male student. It's a very recent study. And so again, that's on our end as faculty to pay attention to how are we responding to students, how are we trying to engage them, because again, that's something that contributes to students' engagement or disengagement.
Thank you. There are a couple questions about the research on the effectiveness of restorative discipline or restorative justice, restorative discipline practices in keeping students in the classroom, or other outcomes compared with other methods or quote unquote usual care.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can respond to that. And I, in fact, was looking forward to responding to that. Texas Education Agency, I'm in Texas, has recognized that restorative discipline, well, this began back in 2014 when Arne Duncan had that call to change, right? So restorative discipline became a consideration at that time. After the first few years of restorative discipline practices in a couple of pilot schools, Texas Education Agency noticed that in those particular schools, the suspension and rate decreased and the graduation rate increased. So there was some evidence initially to really to cause CEA to look at that as an alternative for zero tolerance discipline. So in 2016, Dallas ISD, they had an initiative to incorporate restorative discipline into their schools and into 4 of their schools. They did 2 elementaries, a middle school and a high school. And what they found was, it was six schools. And they found that after only 1 year of implementation, and I can tell you that it was not implemented with fidelity because it was the initial year. So after 1 year of implementation of restorative practices, the student suspensions and expulsions decreased significantly. Now, what we still need to look at is what was the psychological impact, because we want not only to reduce suspensions and expulsions, but we also want to grow our students emotionally and to become better citizens. So they said 70% of out of school suspensions dropped, 77% of expulsions dropped, and 70% of expulsions, that's the number of students who went to alternative schools it dropped 77%. Also, restorative discipline practices were implemented in New Zealand with the Maori students. And the Maori students are a group of indigenous students. And just like any nation where there's been colonization, the indigenous people are typically oppressed and suffer more through education than any other group. So they found that that although this is this population, the Maori people are 15% of the population, they made up 51% of the prisoners. So they were also, those Maori students were 2.5 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. And they were also twice as likely to be unemployed and suffer from serious health issues. So they decided as an entire school district in New Zealand to incorporate restorative discipline. And their findings were incredibly successful in this effort, that not only did this reduce drastically suspensions and expulsions, but it also decreased the number of prisoners going into going into prison as well. So yeah, there's a lot of research and more research that suggests that restorative practices are beneficial not only in America but throughout throughout the world.
Thank you so much for that. We're in our last few minutes of the webinar, and we typically try to end with what can we do. So there are several questions about partnerships and policy. So partnerships, particularly for schools, in schools to support students who are struggling, partnerships with families, partnerships, someone had put into the sort of registration questions about it takes a village. How can we think about the kinds of partnerships that we need to be establishing now as to try to mitigate what looks to be an expanding educational gap that we're going to be facing at the end of this pandemic? Either one of you, if you can talk about the partnerships, about the policies, the practices that we need to be thinking about now as we're going into the next 6 months of this, what looks to be the next 6 months of this pandemic.
So one of the things that I'm working to launch with, there's an IT company that I actually met that does blockchain, which is too long to explain here, but I was connected through a friend at IBM, was to develop an infrastructure where we could have a needs assessment of the local public schools, and then have an assets assessment of local universities and other local agencies of things that there's surplus. There's literally millions of pounds of surplus of things that we actually throw away that schools could use. And my goal is to call it Project EdShare, but the idea is to connect these local public school needs so that it would be as simple as teachers and principals, paraprofessionals at the school be able to go into this site and say, here are some things that we need, and already there are some universities locally, here are some things that we have, and make that connection. You would think we'd already have something like that it wouldn't be a novel idea, but that's one of the things that, as far as partnering, that I'm hoping that I can get launched, and for it to become a national thing, so that each local, so we wouldn't have to worry so much about long transport trying to get something from the West Coast to the East Coast, but it's something as simple as your university that's 20 miles from you may have laptops or other things that you might need that they're not using.
Mm-hmm. If I might add, and this is just a shameless plug for my my education consultation firm, we partner with school districts to provide professional development to teachers. And what we found is that the teacher is the bridge, right, from to everything. If a student is going to get in trouble, it is going to happen in the classroom. Even if it's in the hallway, the teacher is going to be the one. Seldom are the administrators the one catching students, right? So the teacher is also the one that kind of incorporates a restorative practice in the classroom. So my company, Strategy Learning Solutions, provides professional development for educators, and we partner with urban schools to provide not only professional development for teachers, but also for students as well. And we do it through a program called Bows and Bow Ties, where we talk about students' social media presence and professionalism in the classroom, and different types of behavior for different environments. So we are, really excited about working in that respect as a partner.
Cool. Thank you so much to our presenters. I'm going to turn it over to Al to close us out and to tell us a little bit more about the structural inequalities workshop that he's chatted into the chat box, so everyone has that information. Al, please.
Yes, thank you, Giselle, and thank you to our guest today. This has been an amazing presentation. I think certainly very timely, and just thinking about what we can do through partnerships to address the educational needs of our students and of our families and our communities. I want to acknowledge that Community Campus Partnerships for Health is launching its annual Introduction to Dismantling Structural Racism training. This has been training that we've offered for the past 3 years. We're excited. We're moving towards a virtual platform. And you can find out more about that. We'll be posting registration information on our website at ccphealth.org. You can mark your calendar. The training dates are September 30th and October 7th. And both days are 11:45 till 3:30 Pacific Standard Time. And again, visit our website to find out more about the pricing for the event and also to register. We want to again encourage you to complete the registration and give us amazing feedback today about this session, and even offer suggestions for future sessions. Follow us on our discussion board, both on CCPH and on CHER. We look forward to future sessions, and we want to say again, thank you for joining us today, and visit both the CHER and CCP Health websites. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.